our last speaker for today. She is Nadine Dijkstra from the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging. And please, Nadine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't have any cool fMRI data as my last two speakers do, so it's only behavioral, but I hope it's still going to be interesting. I'm going to talk to you today about a recent project that I did together with Matan Mazur, Peter Koch, and Steve Fleming about the influence of mental imagery on perceptual detection. Let me just get this done. Okay, so when we are walking down the street like this, we are bombarded with visual input. Our brain rapidly processes different shapes and textures and colors to create the visual experience that we perceive. But at the same time, we are often also caught up in thinking. We might, for example, remember the cool city trip that we went on way before COVID made international travel impossible, or the interesting lecture that we saw earlier that week during Neuromatch. And both of those processes are also accompanied by internally generated mental images. Now, various lines of research have shown that when we imagine a stimulus, similar neural representations in sensory areas become active as when we would actually see that stimulus in real life. And this neural overlap between imagery and perception has been shown using many different paradigms, stimuli, and techniques, so it's well established. But given that we often engage in mental imagery while actually also receiving external input, the question arises, does imagery actually influence our perception? Now, we tried to investigate this in this study using the following experimental design. So we asked participants to detect in a blockwise fashion left or right tilted gratings that gradually appeared in noise. So over time, the grating became more and more visible until about threshold. And every trial they had to indicate whether they did or did not see a stimulus there. So it was a simple detection task. And then we manipulated the imagery by just asking participants in some blocks to also imagine the stimulus that they were going to detect at the same time. So just to give you an idea of what this experiment looked like, I'm going to show you an example trial. So please form a mental image of this grating. So in the actual experiment, we didn't show the gratings, but I'm just going to show it to you so that it's easier to imagine. So form a mental image. Now keep imagining it as if the grating was still presented here in the square. Keep imagining the grating as vividly as you can. I think oh no, did you see the video? I don't think it worked, did it? There was a video. Anyway, so the grating was supposed to gradually ramp up, but I don't think it's working. Anyway, the idea would be that sometimes it's a bit difficult to then see whether there was actually a grating there or whether you just imagined it. So that's the idea. And then we analyzed these data using signal detection theory. I'm just going to give a quick recap of SDT for people who are not familiar with it. The idea is that we can categorize trials based on whether a stimulus was present or absent, and whether participants responded with, yes, there's a stimulus present, or no, there's no stimulus present. If people say yes, when there also was a stimulus there, then that's a hit. If they say yes, when there wasn't a stimulus there, that's a false alarm. If they say no, when there was a stimulus there, it's a miss. And if they say no, when there also wasn't a stimulus there, this is a correct rejection. And now based on the proportion of trials in each of these cells, we can calculate two main measures of perceptual detection. The first one is D prime, or perceptual detection sensitivity. And it's basically an unbiased measure of accuracy. So how well can someone separate signal from noise? And it's calculated based on the percentage of hits versus false alarms. The other measure is criterion C, and it's a measure of how likely someone is to say yes versus no, irrespective of whether a stimulus was present or not. So just the likelihood of saying yes, there's a stimulus there. And then we asked the question, how does mental imagery influence these different aspects of perceptual detection? So since it's a global pandemic, we collected our data online using Prolific, and we tried to ensure data quality using a few different measures. First of all, we staircase the perceptual threshold per participant. The idea would be that this would take into account some differences in lighting and viewing distance and screen resolution, etc. And then we removed participants if they had a detection accuracy below chance or above 95%, because that would indicate that the staircasing didn't really work. And then we also removed participants if they answered incorrectly the imagery check, because after every block we asked participants, hey, did you imagine a stimulus or not? And if they didn't answer these questions correctly, then that shows that they didn't really follow the instructions. So that was the idea. Now, for the first experiment, we ended up with 96 good participants. So that's the good thing about online data collection. It's easy to get big samples. And I'm just going to show you first the D prime for both the no imagery and the imagery condition. Remember, the only difference between the imagery and the no imagery condition is whether or not people imagined the stimulus at the same time while they were detecting that stimulus. So we see that there's a slight decrease in D prime. It becomes a bit clearer if I show you the pairwise subtraction here. So this is imagery minus no imagery blocks. And then you see that there's a significant decrease in D prime caused by imagery. So if people are imagining the stimulus, they are less good at externally detecting it. But we also saw an even clearer effect on criterion. So basically, when people are imagining the stimulus, they are more likely to say that an external stimulus is present than when they are not imagining it. We were thinking maybe that's an hallucination, yeah, but I'm going to come back to that later. So we see this increase in presence responses both for the false alarms. So they are more likely to say stimulus is there when there actually wasn't a stimulus there, but also for the hits. So they're also more likely to say a stimulus is there when there also was a stimulus there when they are imagining. The effect on the false alarms is bigger than the effect on hits, which is why we see an effect on D prime, because theoretically criterion and D prime are orthogonal. So you could have an increase in presence responses without actually changing your performance. But we see here that people are more likely to say a stimulus is there, especially when it's not there in real life. So we were thinking that maybe this was imagery being confused for perception. And then we were thinking that maybe we can also get the opposite. So maybe we can also get people to confuse their perception for imagery. So instead decreasing their presence responses. And we were thinking that maybe if people don't really expect that an external stimulus is going to be present, so maybe if they think it's very unlikely that there's going to be a stimulus present, then maybe in that case, they will attribute their sensory signals to imagination instead. So maybe if we manipulate the expectation of presence and absence, maybe then we can reverse this, this effect on criterion. So we did that in a second experiment, and we manipulated the expectation of presence and absence by changing the base rate of stimulus presentation. So in one condition, we only presented the stimulus in 20% of the trials, and in another condition in 80% of the trials. So in the 20% condition, people have a lower expectation of stimulus presence, right? Now, in this case, we didn't find any effect on D prime. So here I'm again showing you the difference between the imagery and no imagery blocks. But we again found a significant decrease in criterion in both the 20% and the 80% conditions. So this means that imagining a stimulus while at the same time detecting it just increases the probability of saying that the stimulus is present, irrespective of whether you expect stimulus presence or absence. But in both of these experiments, the imagined and the to be detected stimulus were always the same. So we always had asked people to imagine the same stimulus as the one that they had to detect, which means that we can't be sure whether this is a stimulus-specific effect. So if it's source confusion, then it should be stimulus-specific, right? Otherwise, it could just be that just general imagination increases people's likelihood to say something is there. So to check whether this is stimulus-specific, we ran a final experiment in which we also included an incongruent condition in which participants imagined a stimulus orthogonal to the one that they were detecting. So I'm just going to draw your attention first to the effect here on criterion. So we again see that for congruent imagery, we see a decrease in criterion, and this is now the third replication of this effect. But for incongruent imagery, we don't see such a decrease. So if people imagine a different stimulus, then they are not more likely to say that the stimulus is present. Now, if we look at D prime, we see the opposite effect. Now, similar to experiment 2, we don't find an effect on D prime for congruent imagery, but we find a decrease in D prime for incongruent imagery. And we think that that's probably due to the fact that imagining an orthogonal stimulus to the one that you're detecting is just more cognitively demanding. So that makes the detection task more difficult to do because it's just more effort. Now, we also looked at individual differences because there are large individual differences both in imagery ability and vividness, as well as in perceptual detection criterion and sensitivity. So we thought maybe these two things are related somehow. Maybe external detection and internal imagery do share. I mean, we know they share some neural mechanisms, and maybe they also share some behavioral effects. So we measured imagery ability using the VVIQ, the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire, and we also measured hallucination proneness with an LHS questionnaire, and we correlated with everything and nothing. We didn't find anything, so everything was flat. All the correlations were 0, but we did find a very interesting correlation still, thankfully. So we also asked participants to practice their imagery during this dynamic stimulus, because that's a bit weird, right? To imagine something while you're also looking at a dynamically changing stimulus. So we had a practice session before the main task started, and people were asked to rate their imagery vividness after each trial using a Likert scale. So we just had a very simple rating of vividness as well. And we found that this vividness rating correlated negatively with general perceptual detection criterion. So people with highly vivid imagery also have a lower detection criterion. So they are more likely to say a stimulus is present, and they are also more likely to say they have high imagery vividness. And importantly, this correlated in both conditions. So it wasn't that it was about the effect of imagery on detection, but it was really the general detection threshold correlated with imagery vividness. And we replicated this over all 3 experiments. So it seems to be a very robust correlation. All right, now to conclude, we found that imagining a stimulus while externally detecting that same stimulus, but not when you're detecting a different stimulus, increases the probability of reporting stimulus presence, irrespective of whether you expect stimulus presence or absence. And we can explain this by either a response effect or a sensory effect. So we cannot be sure which one it is based on these data. It's possible that just imagining the same stimulus increased people's probability of responding yes without actually changing their perception, right? We can't know that, whether it's just a response or a sensory effect. But given that we do know that imagery recruits low-level sensory areas and that it does change our visual experience, we think that it's unlikely to just be a response effect, but we need future research to fully dissociate these 2 explanations. Now, we also found that people with more vivid imagery have an increased tendency to report also the presence of external stimuli. This can also be explained as either a response effect or a sensory effect. So it could be that, for example, there's some common internal and external presence thresholds that varies between people. So it's just the kind of likelihood of saying something is there, whether it's imagined or real. Just, you know, some people are more likely to say something is there than others. And this suggests that that would be shared for imagery and perception, which is interesting, I think. It could also be some kind of sensory effect, for example, that both detection threshold as well as imagery vividness relate to some sensory processing property like visual cortex excitability. So people with more excitable visual cortex maybe have more vivid imagery and also a lower detection criterion. That's also possible. So future research for that as well. But anyways, I think these results do show that imagery and perception are highly related, like more than we maybe even thought before, and that they can really influence each other. And it also shows that sometimes when we imagine something, the sensory activation generated internally can cross some kind of external threshold and can lead to imagery being confused for perception or hallucinations. Now, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank my collaborators also. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Congratulations, very interesting work. And we have already 5 questions, so go directly to them. So Marco said, thank you for the very interesting presentation, Nadine. Do you think the increase in bias and or in D will change with more biologically relevant stimuli, for example, faces?
I think so. That's a super interesting question, and I think future research is necessary. But my intuition would be that the increase would be lower because imagining more biologically relevant stimuli is more difficult. So I would just think that then the overlap between imagery and perception is lower, so that you get just less strong effects. That's why we also picked gratings, because it's very easy to imagine them. So that's my intuition. I
see. Then a question from Ilya. Have you found anything beyond VVIQ which can be used to find people who are better at imagery? We used it at our lab and it's also didn't correlate with anything during 2 experiments.
No. Sorry, my answer is no. No, I mean, apparently Likert skill ratings work a bit better. I think if you have an imagery rating for the specific task that you're doing, then that usually works better, at least in my experience, because you have different kinds of imagery, right? And the VVIQ measures one kind, but then maybe measuring the specific imagery for your specific task is better. And you could also think about more objective methods like the Pearson binocular rivalry method, which aims to measure imagery ability more objectively.
And I think we have a follow-up question about this topic. So Heida asked, why do you think that your simple Likert scale works while the VVIQ is not correlated with anything? And were the Likert and the VVIQ not themselves correlated with each other?
So to answer your last question first, yes, they were correlated slightly, but not very convincingly. So I think it's maybe related to what Haida recently gave a talk, and she said maybe the VVIQ is just not very good to use different colorful language, but I think that's probably maybe something. But also what I just mentioned is that maybe you need to measure the specific kind of imagery that you're doing in that specific task. And maybe the VVIQ is just too general in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. And then a brief detail for Rebecca. Did the participant get feedback?
Oh, no, they didn't. No,
Okay,
which I was thinking that maybe is a bit mean, because then maybe they think they are constantly hallucinating or something, but we didn't give them feedback. So. Yeah.
Perfect. Then we have a question from Jacob. Would the measure of suggestibility be useful to determine whether your findings are due to a response bias or sensory effect?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think it relates to the recent discussion on the rubber hand illusion. So we are thinking about that now, about how to dissociate these different explanations. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. So I think we can wrap up this.